Hi everyone. The first section here will go over the reading by Sandra Bartky on psychological oppression analytically. So we'll go section by section here quickly, and then we'll talk about the essay as a whole. Yours may look somewhat different from this, so long as you have given a summary that touches on salient features of each of the sections. So I don't expect that the reading summaries will all look exactly the same, but you should be noting, summarizing those things that bring out the most important features of each section. So let's see what we've got here. Let's start with the thesis. I took the thesis of Bartky's piece to be something like this, that our ordinary concept of oppression needs to be expanded to include an analysis of psychological oppression, which strikes at a person's agency and autonomy, and thus at a person's identity and personhood. Generally, what she's saying here is that Marilyn Frye's conception of oppression is great. However, we need to add to that. We need to understand oppression more broadly, because we need to understand oppression as also including an aspect that is psychological. And that psychological aspect of oppression is very important because it undermines or attacks a person's agency, decision-making capabilities, and their autonomy, their ability to make decisions and choices on their own. And so that also affects then a person's identity, how they identify, what their personal identity and social identity is like, as well as their very personhood itself. We typically understand personhood as a being that has both agency and autonomy. Now, what we mean by these things, identity, autonomy, agency, are somewhat open, and we can have discussions about these in the last section of the class. We will certainly have discussions about these, particularly what we mean when we talk about autonomy. This is the sort of the main point or claim of her piece. She's trying to get you to agree that she's right about the fact that oppression needs to include an element or an aspect of psychological oppression. In the first section, she argues that in the same way that Fanon observes of blacks, particularly the black man, in his analysis in Black Skin, White Masks, women are psychically alienated through stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification, and fragmentation and mystification occur in each mode of psychological oppression. So she's identified here sort of the structure of her essay. She's going to discuss three modes or types of psychological oppression. Stereotyping is one mode, cultural domination is one mode, and sexual objectification is one mode. And in each of those modes, we can see a kind of fragmentation and mystification. So we should understand already, just after reading through the very first section, that what Bartky is saying here is that there are three modes of psychological oppression in Fanon's piece, and she finds those same three modes to be at play in gender oppression, and that we ought to identify the ways in which stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification are psychologically oppressive. Further, she's going to show that the means or part of the phenomenology of this kind of oppression is a kind of fragmentation that happens in each of these three modes and a kind of mystification that occurs in each of these three modes. So we want to understand what each of these three modes means, and we want to understand what fragmentation means and how it happens in each of these three modes. And we want to understand what mystification means and how it happens in each of these three modes. In section 2, Bartky talks about how stereotyping is psychologically oppressive in two distinct ways. So now she's on to her first mode of psychological oppression, stereotyping. And she wants to say this mode of psychological oppression, stereotyping, is psychologically oppressive, and there are two ways in which we can understand it to be so. First, The first way is that those who hold stereotype beliefs about me cannot possibly understand my needs or respect my rights as a person. And second, the second way that stereotyping is psychologically oppressive is that I may internalize the stereotype and find it difficult to exercise autonomy or achieve self-actualization. Internalization is a big issue. Stereotyping of women is tied in with prescribed gender roles. And this is important. Even if economic and political obstacles were removed, there can still be psychological oppression. So even if we achieve something like equality, say women have the equal right to vote, blacks have the equal right to vote, everybody has equal access to resources, despite their race or gender. Even if we got rid of the economic and political obstacles that cause systematic oppression, Bartky's arguing here that, look, there can still be something like psychological oppression. And I think if we look around, that's hopefully pretty apparent that what we have instituted in this society might be policies and norms that have instituted political and economic equality. Yet at the same time, that doesn't mean that sexism and racism no longer exist. Right? That doesn't mean that there's not something like gender oppression and racial oppression. In fact, if we're thoughtful and aware, and if we really listen and watch what's going on around us carefully, and with the right resources and tools, it seems to me that we can see that gender and racial oppression are still very much so alive in our society. And this is Bartky's point. In the third section, she argues that we often believe the psychic burdens of psychological oppression to be part of our character, the result of immaturity, maladjustment, or even neurosis. We don't have a native culture. The culture of our men is our culture, and thus the subordination of women appears to be natural and unchangeable. What she's getting at here is that oftentimes when we go through these things that are psychically alienating, we often internalize stereotypes about ourselves. What happens is we believe those things to be part of our inner character, that there's something wrong with us, that we haven't grown in the right way, that we haven't adjusted in the right way, that we're neurotic in some way. But oftentimes, these issues that seem personal are actually structural. They're due to a structural form of oppression. What we're suffering is not some character flaw unique to us, but we're suffering the effects of gender oppression or racial oppression, psychologically. In section 4, Bartky argues that, like Fanon's account of the black man, women are subject to pervasive, habitual sexual objectification, subjecting one's very being to compulsive sexualization, regardless of a woman's interests. Like Fanon says, the black man becomes the genitals. Women become sexualized. Part of what it is to be a woman is to be a sexual object. So we've moved to the second mode of psychological oppression here, sexual objectification. So sexual objectification is a way of perceiving and a way of maintaining dominance over women through the derogation of her identity as a woman. In being a woman, one is subject to pervasive and habitual objectification. This is tied in with gender roles, and it doesn't matter what a particular woman's interests or needs are, because sexual objectification is a way of perceiving who you are as a woman and maintaining dominance over women through the undermining or derogation of her very own identity as a woman. You might recall Fry's door opening ritual, a seemingly innocent practice that Fry identifies as purposefully seemingly innocent, but tied into, mystified, but tied into the system of barriers that are oppressive. And Bartky's making a similar point here. The way that women are seen as women, as such, just perceiving someone as a woman, already puts her into an objectified position where her identity, autonomy, and agency is being undermined. She cannot self-identify because she's already being identified as a particular kind of being. We'll talk more about this in the Beauvoir essay. Okay, section 5. In section 5, Bartky is arguing that not understanding oppression as also psychological restricts our understanding of the categories of persons we might want to classify as oppressed, since suffering is not merely economic or political, but it's psychological, suffering in one's personhood. It's dehumanizing and depersonalizing. It threatens autonomy and one's participation in the production of culture. So here we have that third mode of psychological oppression, the cultural domination, the inability to participate in the production of culture. So psychological oppression is psychic alienation, and it's mystified through the naturalization of identity, race, or in this case, gender, leaving one in a double bind, and shameful, or with an inferiority complex or false consciousness. Cultural domination is a form of psychological oppression wherein certain persons are restricted from the production of what we understand to be culture, literature, movie making, idea making, knowledge production. This very oppression is in turn mystified or made invisible through the naturalization of identity. Oh, women, they're just not the kind of people who do those things, right? Which leaves women in a double bind because they're both seen as persons and at the same time not as persons, which causes a great deal of shame, feelings of inferiority, something like a false consciousness. In section 6, Bartky argues that the alienation of labor, where the product of labor is split off from the worker and her labor and human functioning is reduced to a means to sustain life, resulting in a loss of self. Similarly, psychic alienation involves the splitting of human functions from the person through external dominance. She says, quote, "To be a victim of domination is to have a part of one's being stolen by another." So since oppression is interlocking, oppressions will not disappear until the system as a whole is overthrown. And obviously, to overthrow the system as a whole, we have to identify and then mitigate psychological oppression. Right? So in this last section, Bartky is comparing the psychic alienation or the psychological oppression of women to the class oppression that Marx theorizes about in his work. So she's describing the ways in which we become alienated from our very selves, from our creative processes. Okay, so that's a quick overview section by section. Next, we'll look at Bartky's on psychological oppression from a more sort of holistic perspective. All right, so Bartky's trying to convey the idea that there is another kind of oppression that we need to attend to, and that's psychological oppression. She's not trying to discount the importance of discussions like Marilyn Frye's and other discussions that focus on the economic and political aspects of oppression. Those are certainly really important, but what Bartky's trying to uncover in this essay is that there's another element, there's another aspect, there's another mode of oppression that is actually quite harmful, and identifying it can be helpful to persons who are oppressed in this way to identify those kinds of oppressions and learn to understand more about their own identity, more about their own agency and autonomy, and thus have a means of liberation from these kinds of oppressions that are psychological and that cause fragmentation and that cause internalization of stereotypes. So she's giving us this account which ought to be helpful to us in different ways. So as we identified in the sectional analysis, Bartky is basing this account off of France Fanon's account in Black Skin, White Masks, and she is explaining the ways in which gender oppression causes experiences of these three kinds of psychological oppression: stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification. In this section, we will look at each of those a little bit more closely so that we understand what she means by each of those three kinds of psychological oppression, and we'll try to understand what Bartky means by fragmentation and what Bartky means by mystification, because these are all things that are going to be major themes in many of the readings that we'll do in this course. So we want to get clear from the outset on what we're talking about when we're talking about fragmentation and what we're talking about when we're talking about mystification. Let's start with stereotyping, though. So this first kind or mode of psychological oppression is stereotyping, and as Bartky says, stereotyping prevents others from knowing and understanding my needs as a person, as a human being, as an agent, as a self. And that prevention of being understood by others contributes to my internalizations and beliefs in the stereotype that I am being sort of grouped in. And that kind of stereotyping prevents and undermines self-actualization, autonomy, and self-determination. So autonomy and agency. Now, we want to understand how fragmentation is related to stereotyping in particular. And so remember that fragmentation is the splitting of the whole person into parts of a person. When you use stereotyping, you take one aspect, whether it be a visible identity marker or something that's not visible but it's a practice, or some aspect of a person's being that you take and you allow that to stand for the person in their entirety. We are all very complex beings, but stereotyping sort of picks out one aspect of a person or a group's being and allows that aspect of their being to stand for, to represent who they are as a person, undermining their complexity, undermining their agency and autonomy, right? So since fragmentation is this means of splitting a person into various parts, where one part becomes salient, more salient than other parts, fragmentation through stereotyping causes us to see ourselves in a very non-unified way. We see ourselves sometimes as weak, yet at the same time we think we're strong. We see ourselves as dependent, yet sometimes we feel independent, because we come to know ourselves more and more by the stereotypes that are applied to us, and this causes a kind of cognitive dissonance in how we understand ourselves. And the way that mystification works in stereotyping is that we experience and struggle against stereotypes that are mystified, that is, they're obscured. So remember that mystification is the systematic obscuring of reality and agency through psychological oppression. And that systematic obscuring of reality causes a depreciation of the self. And that depreciation of the self is lived out as a sense of destiny, as a sense of guilt or neurosis or inferiority or maladjustment. So what's actually structural and systemic becomes a kind of self-ascription, a self-ascription of guilt or inferiority. Given that mystification is the obscuring or the making invisible of systematic forces at play that have an effect on individual persons, the way that mystification is important in stereotyping is that in stereotyping, we experience and struggle against the kind of stereotypes that become mystified and obscured. We then believe ourselves to be insecure, inferior, neurotic, immature, maladjusted, because the systematicity of the effects of psychological oppression are hidden. And remember, this was Fry's point when she talked about the ways in which we have to take a macroscopic perspective in order to see the systematicity of oppression. This applies to Bartky's account as well, because those wires of the birdcage, those barriers, those networks and systems of oppression become mystified, and we don't see them as obstacles of oppression. We don't see them as networks of oppression at all. In fact, we don't see the oppression, we don't see the forces, because they become obscured. They become naturalized in such a way that we just accept that that's just how things are. So if you're thinking about gender roles or stereotypes that we have against different racial groups or ethnic groups, different genders for sure, you can think and say, well, you're just being all crazy women's liber. But the fact is that the systematicity of these kinds of networks and systems do cause political, economic, and psychological oppression. And so mystification is a way that society works to make those forces invisible so that they are not recognized as oppressive, but just as the way the world is, when in fact that's not just the way the world is. Those are purposefully constructed systems oppressing people. Okay, let's look at cultural domination, the second type or kind or mode of psychological oppression that Bartky talks about. And in cultural domination, Bartky wants to explain that what happens is that women don't really have a culture of their own. The group women is a bit different than other oppressed groups, whether it be racial groups, ethnic groups, or even age groups, groups based on sexuality. Women don't tend to have a separate culture of their own, right? Like black culture, gay culture, Jewish culture, etc. There's not really a women's culture. The culture of our men just is our culture. Women tend to be aligned with their men rather than with other women. Women have no cultural autonomy. Our culture is the culture of men, and it's a culture that's saturated in sexism. The way that fragmentation figures into cultural domination is that because we're both part of, yet not part of culture, I must be myself, yet be a universal subject. And this is very difficult to do. I mean, even if you just think about the language, whether it be literature, religious texts, fiction, philosophy, if you look back at the way that language has been used in the past, at least in the English language, we use the word men to represent people. There's this kind of notion of a universal subject. Yet, there's this sense that when we talk about people, we're talking about everyone, but at the same time, we don't see everyone represented in the books that we read, in the movies that we watch, in the music that we listen to. The culture itself has historically been very male-dominated, and for that reason, at least sexist and many times misogynist. So women are both part of culture because we are persons, but we're not really full persons. So we're not really fully a part of culture, and we're not part of cultural production. Think about it. How many artists do you know? If you like art, how many artists can you name? Name 5 artists. Magritte, Dali, Picasso, Monet. It's pretty easy to name artists. But how many female artists can you name? Maybe Frida Kahlo, perhaps Georgia O'Keeffe. There just aren't as many female artists as there are male artists. It's similar in literature. How many great American writers can you name? How many of those are women? How many presidents can you name? How many US presidents can you name? And how many of those are women? None. There's a sense in which the culture in which we live has simply been male culture. And for that reason, women are fragmented beings, according to Bartky. We're part of culture, yet we're not really part of culture. I should be myself, yet I should also be a universal subject. And a universal subject is this rational subject who is just kind of like a placeholder, all the same. But I don't find myself to be the same as any other subject. And the ways in which I'm different aren't represented in culture. All right, so let's talk about the third kind of psychological oppression, sexual objectification. The sexual parts or functions are separated from one's person and personality, and I'm reduced to the status of a body part or a bodily function through compulsive sexualization. The way that fragmentation is related to sexual objectification is that in splitting a person into parts, it forces a kind of coerced identification of a person as a body part. Bartky tells the story of a friend or colleague who goes on an interview for a job in philosophy, and this is very prevalent in philosophy and probably other disciplines as well. And she shows up for the interview, and her interviewer is male. Of course, he's the head of the department, and he's male. And he stares at her breasts the entire time. And obviously, she doesn't get the job. She probably doesn't perform well, because the entire interview, she's aware that he's staring at her breasts. He's not listening to what she's saying. He's not relating to her as a philosopher. He's relating to her as a sexual object. And when women are constantly sexually objectified, and we become aware of this objectification, and it kind of forces us to attend to the fact that we're being sexually objectified. It takes our energy and our attention away from doing other things. So although we might try to be a philosopher or a writer or a nurse or a teacher, we have to spend a lot of energy and attention understanding that we're being fragmented into different parts. And one of the salient parts that's being recognized by other people, particularly by men, is the way in which we are seen as sexual objects. This fragmentation through sexual objectification forces a kind of coerced identification of a person as a body, and we can internalize that. And quite frankly, it's draining. And it causes us to pay more attention to things like our weight, beauty products, beauty standards. The amount of time and energy that women put into being sexual objects because they're aware that they're sexually objectified is completely mind-blowing. The fact that we have to constantly be aware of our weight and who's looking at us and what we're wearing. Not only is this cause fragmentation, it also involves a kind of mystification. So the fact that sexual objectification is a naturalized part of life in this society becomes mystified. It comes to seem just like that's the way things are, right? So remember, mystification is this obscuring or making invisible of the systems and forces at play. And so the obscuring of compulsive sexualization causes a kind of internalism of this kind of oppression as a neurotic focus on body size, a neurotic focus on beauty standards, and also an identification with the self as a sexual object. And this is really, really problematic because it keeps women from doing other things that they could be doing in terms of self-actualization and creative activities, becoming the people that they want to be. Okay, so we might ask how Bartky's account is different from Fry's account. Although there are some similarities in these two accounts, Bartky is using a distinct kind of methodology here. So rather than looking for and identifying the necessary and sufficient conditions for oppression, which is what Fry did, if you remember, Fry argued that the three necessary and sufficient conditions were that oppression is systematic and had to be identified from a macroscopic perspective, that only persons who are members of a particular group that is targeted qualify as being oppressed, and that persons who are oppressed have a distinct relationship to the barrier. Right? So these are necessary and sufficient conditions of oppression, according to Fry. But Bartky's taking a different kind of approach. She's not looking for necessary and sufficient conditions approach. She's not saying if you meet these conditions, you're oppressed. If you don't meet these conditions, you're not oppressed. She's allowing us to Through a phenomenological approach, she's allowing us to look at her experience of oppression and to see if we can identify with what she's talking about. She's saying, hey, look, it seems to me through my life experiences that oppression can be psychological, and that there's something important that we can do in identifying these aspects of psychological oppression. We can learn more about ourselves and our world. We can maybe open up some space for greater agency, for greater self-actualization, if we can identify the ways in which stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification affect our lives as women. However, she doesn't want to lump all women together in one group in the way that Fry does. Bartky is saying, look, everyone's probably going to experience this differently. The amount and kind of sexual objectification you experience is going to vary depending on many things, including your age, your race, your ethnicity, your sexuality, etc. But it is likely that all women experience sexual objectification, although they don't experience sexual objectification in the same way. Same thing with cultural domination and stereotyping. This account serves to give us tools so that we can use these tools, these concepts, to recognize the ways in which these things affect us personally, individually, and illuminate the effects of psychological oppression in our lives so that we can attend to those effects and minimize the effects, the negative effects of psychological oppression, use our time and resources to shape our own identities and become the kinds of beings that we want to be, rather than to allow systems of oppression to completely shape us. Please watch the next 10 minutes. I'm going to add a video that should really illuminate the depths to which psychological oppression, particularly through stereotyping, cultural domination, and sexual objectification, although this video is not really going to emphasize sexual objectification because it's looking at race, but I think you'll be able to see the ways in which that's a parallel. But the ways in which we as human beings internalize things like stereotypes and objectification and cultural domination in such a way that it shapes us to a great, great degree. If you haven't seen this video before, it's a video of an experiment called the Clark experiment, and it was redone by an undergraduate student in the 2000s, I believe, and it really reveals the extent to which, at a very young age, we're already internalizing what society is saying about us. Please watch this and think about the ways in which this video exemplifies the kinds of things that Bartky was trying to say in her analysis.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll? Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me?
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Who taught you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate, you should ask yourself who taught you to hate being what God gave you.
Every black female has a big butt and big boobs.
Loud, obnoxious, ghetto.
Light skin being more attractive than dark skin.
We're not smart. We're this way, we're that way. And a lot of times we have to prove ourselves as not being true.
At a young age, I already knew the standards for a girl like me. As I become older, they become more obvious.
You have to have permed hair, relaxed hair.
You know, straight hair or like blonde hair, you know, long waves or something.
And if it's natural, that's good hair. Like bad hair is hair you have to relax because it's kinky.
Like it's not like appealing to have like natural hairstyles, or like if they are natural, they have to be like the curly head like black girls or something that looks mixed or something.
And I remember when I first started wearing my hair natural, at first my mom was okay with it. And she thought it looked nice. And then after like the second day, she was like, oh, stop that. She was like, you're starting to look African. I was like, well, I am African. And that really pissed me off.
There are standards that are imposed upon us, like, you know, you're prettier if you're light-skinned.
I knew people in the past that just wanted to be light-skinned, not for any particular reason, you know, because they love themselves. I mean, they love themselves except for, you know, the color of their skin.
Like my siblings are all lighter than me, and my mom, she's dark-skinned, but she's lighter than me. So, like, I noticed, and I was like, hey, how come I'm the darkest? And, you know, everybody else is so light, and I don't know. Since I was younger, I also considered being lighter as a form of beauty, or, you know, beautiful than being dark skinned. So I used to think of myself as being ugly because I was dark skinned.
I knew people who actually went out there and got, you know, bleaching cream and everything. They actually laid in the tub, poured capfuls of bleach into it just so they could see if their skin would get lighter.
But yeah, my aunt that lives in Honduras, she basically started using skin bleaching cream when she was about 25. And she started her oldest daughter on it when she was about 11. And then she has an even younger daughter that was about 6 when she started using the skin bleaching cream on her.
I've seen people say that I would never marry a dark-skinned man because, you know, because I don't want that in my gene pool.
On the other hand, light-skinned girls have their issues too. We've been called high yellow, conceited, house nigga. I feel like both sides have their issues.
I guess I sort of felt like there was not any attention towards me because of maybe my skin color, or because my hair was kinky, or, you know, just basically that. Or even when I was younger, say there was I don't know, a doll. I used to have a lot of dolls, but most of them were just white dolls with long straight hair that I would comb, and I would be like, oh, I wish I was just like this Barbie doll.
In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
This one. I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
He's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you give And why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
Our ancestors came to this country and they were pretty much ripped out of their culture. You know, they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't be themselves. They had to be like what everybody else told them to be.
When you don't know where you're from and you don't know what country you're from, all you know is basically you're from Africa, that's all you're given, I feel like it brings on like a lot of ignorance, and it builds a lot of anger. I've seen it build a lot of anger in a lot of black young females. Like, I don't know, they feel like because they feel like they have a right to disown any kind of, you know, African roots.
I think for a black girl in general, it's like you're missing a piece of you, you know? And for me, yeah, it's like, oh, I don't have any actual heritage, not heritage, but culture. Like, I know I'm from Africa, but, you know, the different countries in Africa have their different cultures, their different morals, their different values. And not knowing that, it sort of keeps us at a loss. And I feel like we're busy searching for it while everybody else in society is throwing their ideas and what they believe we should be at us. But, you know, personally, we know that's not what we should be, but we're going to take it because we don't know exactly what it is that we should be, because we don't really know where we came from.
Who taught you? Who taught you who you are? Who taught you what to hate about yourself? Who taught you what to love about yourself? How do social practices, stereotypes, and normative ideals shape who we are as persons?